Good morning and welcome. June 19th, 2024 marks the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Bologna Declaration, a key milestone in the Bologna process. It has significantly transformed European higher education over the years. In today's session, we will reflect on and debate together the past, present, and future of the Bologna process. And to begin, our rector, Paulo Jorge Ferreira.
Good morning to you all. I will have to speak in English because, as you know, we have guests who do not speak Portuguese. This time, for a change, I will use a presentation. I will use a presentation in an opening session, which is quite unusual because there are a few issues that I want to address, and they, I think, will provoke thought and debate. They might be contradicted by you, but the idea is to stimulate some thought about what Bologna Revolution meant, but especially what it should be in the future. We know it's been... Clearly, I'm not good at doing presentations with a document-based form. So we know that Bologna has been maybe the deepest transformation in the higher education space. We know its history. Of course, we don't know nothing about the future. We do know that higher education is under a lot of pressure due to changing demands in society and in the world. The university degree has been contested as universal value. There are very firms and companies that say they don't want degrees, they want talent. There is an increasing pressure towards vocational training, whereas universities historically tended to have degrees and training that it's more timeless, more based on theory and future-proof values. So there's also a contradiction here. Current demands emphasize skills, maybe too much, rather than critical thinking and creativity. And I will argue that these latter two are critical for the future. And knowledge is very often seen as a private good, as a private commodity, rather than a public good. So the role of public higher education institutions comes here as something that is often seen differently. How did the panorama look like before Bologna and way back before it? The knowledge base was stable within a career, within a lifetime indeed. To know meant to be able to remember, to be able to do it on my own again. So the basic skill was memory. Learning was concentrated in space and time. This strange sentence meant that the student went to one location, stayed there for a while, a period of time, and after that graduated. And that put an end to its trajectory inside higher education. One location in space, one period in time. Most of the time, the student would be addressing a single discipline, like physics. After Bologna, the knowledge base, as we know, is rapidly evolving. That leads to knowledge that rapidly becomes obsolete. To know today means something like, I understand how to use knowledge, structured knowledge, to solve complex problems, and complex problems are often interdisciplinary. The basic skill is no longer memory, is understanding, is being creative. Learning after Bologna became distributed in space so that students could move across borders from country to country, from location to location. Yet, Bologna didn't put an end to concentration in time. There is still one period of time throughout which the student acquires training, and after that, it stopped. And this is a contradiction point, that the knowledge base can quickly become obsolete. Furthermore, because of the complexity of the problems that society is throwing at us, like climate change, mobility, and many others, we need interdisciplinary approaches to higher education as well. These are deep differences that maybe we all know. And we need to go further, considering today's artificial intelligence age and what could happen within a few years. I would say that there will be a growing importance of lifelong learning. If the knowledge base keeps getting out of date at the rate that is growing, then lifelong learning should stand out as a means to address that issue. Reskilling and upskilling will be even more important than they are today. And there's a scenario where, for example, migration leads to an infusion of a pool of new students with different backgrounds and preparations, and all these needs to be worked out by higher education institutions, and it's difficult to do so. Learning maybe gets distributed not only in space, but in time as well. So in time, there are two major differences. We could have learning that is concentrated in time, or in an intensive way to make it compatible with working hours, but also training that it's spread in time, because the student will return to the university time and time again to acquire new knowledge or to update its knowledge. That's the lifelong learning part. And of course, this sets the university before a very different scenario than the scenarios that universities used to whittled years ago, so it's different to handle. How can we handle it? What are the tools that allow us to do better? Well, we either innovate or we will stay behind. That's clearly my way of seeing it, but maybe you have different opinions. Learning to me should be redefined to include lifelong learning. It makes sense, because it's not complete if we do not include that component. We need tailored, personalized, inclusive approaches to learning, rather than the one-size-fits-all approach that has been practiced in higher education ever since we can remember, ever since medieval times. The professor leads with classes. All students in the class should be at nearly the same level. Everything is taught and planned for a class of homogeneous students. The needs of lifelong learning completely destroy that picture. We will have very, very different student populations, different ages, and because of mobility nowadays from different countries, languages, and culture. Knowledge, because of that, should be something that gets constructed rather than transmitted. That's the key message. We should repurpose our institutions in a way that knowledge gets to be constructive rather than the process of filling a glass with water. One solution is to adopt active learning pedagogies and challenge-based learning rather than the guided learning in which the professor was at the center of the action in previous decades and centuries. Spaces inside institutions should be also changed. We need learning spaces where interaction can occur. A learning space is very different from a classroom. A classroom is something like the model of a concert hall in which the professor performs and the students listen to. So, in a sense, I feel that universities should repurpose themselves as places where discovery occurs rather than recall. And this is very easy to say, but much harder to do. What we need now for institutions to have is a vision for degree-based education and a vision and a strategy for lifelong learning. They should both be considered either jointly or separately, but I think it's high time for institutions to take these two missions together as one and develop a strategy towards it. Because of the way society is evolving and the knowledge base is changing, we need to rethink learning methods continuously. It's not a one-shot effort. It should be something done continuously. Teaching methods cannot lag behind scientific or technological change. They should keep up with it. They should be linked with research, and there should be mechanisms of engaging with society. The university cannot operate independently and outside society. It's a part of it. So to keep it in sync with society changing needs, we should engage with it. That means, as ECIU is trying to do and doing for a while, to stimulate, to include stakeholders and to have them, to give them a voice so that they help to steer the institution. And that means being open to industry, to society, to local authorities, not only in one country, but in every country and region where the European University is represented. By means of challenge-based learning, students create solutions. They discover things rather than being taught things. And the challenges should be co-created with industry. That's the CIU approach as well. And they are not self-designed. It's not a challenge designed by an university in an academic way. It's something that has been worked out with society and with industry. The end result, if we do it right, is an institution that fosters critical thinking, needed today more than maybe anything, creativity, transferable skills, something that remains even if the profession or whatever the person does changes throughout its career. Entrepreneurship and innovation should be integrated as well in the curricula somehow, because we all know that Europe lags behind other geographies in the capacity to translate knowledge into innovation and economy. One solution that we have been using, and we have experience with that for a couple of years now, is micro-credentials. Micro-credentials were designed because of a number of challenges. I will very briefly explain the motivation. First, we know that professions are disappearing and some other professions are being created. So there are people without jobs, but maybe somewhere else there will be jobs without people. Our problem, in the sense of higher education problem, is to align the needs of this changing job market with the skills of the workforce. And it's not something that we can do at one go. It's something that should be done continuously because everything is still changing continuously. Degrees do not offer. Degrees like licenciatura or mestrado in Portuguese are not a solution for reskilling and upskilling. No worker will leave its company and stay 2 years at the university, and maybe no company will allow one of its workers to do this. So they take too long to complete. They are not tailored to one person needs. They are tailored to a number of students. They are based on one-size-fits-all approach, and they are unsuitable to deal with learners with different histories, different pasts, different cultures, different ages, different languages. It's also unsuitable to deal with interdisciplinarity because it would lead to a multiplication of degrees that no one can afford. Micro-credentials appear as something very different. First, duration, as the name implies, it's micro. So if it's micro, it's short duration. The fact that it's being short duration means that they are stackable. I can do one now and then one 6 months from now, maybe another 6 years from now in the areas that I need, whenever I need. So they can go into something called a learner's wallet or a professional passport, whatever you want, and it can be digitally maintained and signed. ECIU is already doing that. We were the first European university to assign digital credentials that are digitally signed by the consortium, by the European University. I think we were the first, and as far as I know, we are still the unique one, the only one. I think this goes a long way to provide students with individual learning paths. Each student, each professional has a history, and that history is different among themselves, and their learner's wallet will reflect that. It's available across borders, as in the Bologna ideal. It's also available across discipline borders, because students can choose psychology today and computer science tomorrow. And believe me, those two choices are not, they make sense. They can adopt challenge-based learning, which is essential to promote quality of the teaching and learning process at this scale and level. And the end result will be micro-credentials that are not self-designed by the institution, but co-created with its environment and targeting the needs of that environment. So if we want to go beyond Bologna, I think Europe and Portugal certainly needs a strategy for reskilling and upskilling. Micro-credentials are one solution. We have hundreds of them being offered and seek right now, but they do set questions. Here are a few questions. What is the plan? What is the strategy at the national or at the European level for micro-credentials? Ever since ECIU wrote and published the white paper on micro-credentials, this term, this concept, its advantages have been flowing, and there's some sort of publicity as to the good side of it. But there's no formal adoption right now of a standard for micro-credentials, and the concept is still something that is looked at as work in progress. How about quality assurance? We are well trained and well equipped to do quality assurance and accreditation for degree-based education. Solutions for reskilling and upskilling are much less well covered, either in Portugal or elsewhere in Europe. How to assess the impact of these training units? It's more difficult because they are more disaggregated, because they can be consumed throughout time with maybe years and years of interval. What is the correct way of assessing its impact? There are ideas that come to mind, bearing in mind the motivation for doing it, but it's a deeper question than it looks. And finally, how to make micro-credentials work across borders as in the Bologna spirit. In ECIU, it's solved. Any student can target micro-credentials in Aveiro and then in any of the other 14 universities, and it will all be handled within the consortium. But the dream is to go further and do it throughout Europe without any problem, as in the original Bologna goal. And basically, to wrap up and conclude, because I'm really exceeding, no, not yet, my time. Conclusions: degree and non-degree based education complement, not replace each other. They should have strategies on behalf of each institution so that they can be made to work in the future. ECIU wrote that they are additions to conventional education and degrees. This is in one of the official documents, and it's very well put. As for the Bologna higher education space that was envisaged so many years ago, they are incomplete IR. It's really a provocation. Without inclusive, cross-border, lifelong, individual learning paths. If we do not have this, we have not a fully complete higher education space in Europe, apt, fit for purpose for the challenges of today. We need a vision for all of this. I think we are close to one. We need a strategy, and we need specific policies that encourage institutions to move along this path. And I think basically that this is essential to keep the economy, which is knowledge-based, as you all know, to keep working at full speed when the knowledge is evolving so rapidly as it is today. That's it. Thank you for listening, and I hope some of these comments and remarks might stimulate further work. Thank you. Thank you.
The Bologna process has been a long journey marked by many successes, but 25 years after the Bologna Declaration, how close are we to achieving its original goals and fulfilling the commitments made at each ministerial conference? To discuss this issue, we'll have the following speakers. Michael Gable, Director of the Higher Education Policy Unit of the European University Association, who will be participating via Zoom. Pedro Teixeira, Full Professor at FEP, Senior Researcher at Center for Research in Higher Education Policies. Rosa Vasconcelos, President of the Portuguese Network of Student Ombudspersons in Higher Education, Student Ombudsperson at the University of Minho, and with the moderation of Júlio Pedrosa, President of the General Council of the University Institute of Lisbon, Rector of the University of Aveiro in office when the Bologna Declaration was signed.
Good morning to everybody and welcome to this opportunity to think about university future in his education mission. In fact, when we were in Bologna, there was many interrogations about what should be the future of that declaration. This university made a good work to prepare herself. People should know that we have had an initiative to try to organize a common curriculum for the engineering and sciences. And we had a small committee to work across university with the leadership of Isabella Lacan, our vice rector for the teaching mission. And this discussion at the end have had the following result. Not 2 years, but 1 year we will accept. The second mission of this committee was to reduce the learning hours. And it was possible to bring them to 22 hours. Also a very difficult discussion and mission. And this continued. And I went and saw the documentation we have about the rethinking of curriculum issues. And it is, my rector, I think it is very actual documentation for the moment we are, and to answer your questions in your presentation. So this university has a story which is important to recall and bring to the present day to really be involved with these developments of the Bologna process. We are going to have this discussion now with a contribution with people who are in fact with their hands on work. And I think that the creation of SIP was also a good important moment for our country in higher education. And we have Pedro Teixeira, who has a story of this institution since its creation. So I give him the word for him to contribute. And also we have two other contributions. And I welcome, of course, our long distance contribution. We'll go to that later on. But as far as I know, we will start with Michael Gobel, Director of Higher Education Policy Unit in the European University Association. I should remember that I was visited as rector with the person which at that time was trying to create a starting for a European unit of higher education. So it is very good that we can have today Michael giving his contribution. Please, you have the word now.
Good morning, and thanks for the invitation to this conference and for this kind introduction. And apologies, I just came in now because I've come from another meeting also about Bologna. So I was a bit late, but just heard the last words from Rector Ferreira. And I think I have a few slides and a few things to say that link very much to what he highlighted. And probably, can you see my slides? Yeah, I think you can. Good. Okay, probably to start with the question, where do we actually stand? And I wanted to share this snapshot from the Trends 2024 report, which we published recently. We asked European higher education institutions about different strategies and European strategies and programs, and how they actually resonated with them. And I mean, that's what you get there. So you can see there are quite many which are recognized and important. And the overall conclusion from this slide is that Europe really matters. It's important for the European higher education sector. If you look at the top three of this graph, you will see the Erasmus program and the Horizon program, which are there without doubt. They give all of us funding for our joint work. That's very important. But we were a bit surprised to see also the European higher education area and the Bologna process there. Surprised probably also because we know from previous studies, from previous trends reports, that the Bologna process has not been uncontested. Now, I think growingly with its implementation, this has probably a bit softened, and overall there is more recognition of some of the achievements that the Bologna process has made.
Hi, Professor. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just a slight interruption. Your slides, you're presenting the PowerPoint, not presenter view. So
okay,
we are seeing your slides very tiny on the screen.
Is that okay now?
It is perfect now. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't realize that. So, but now you can see it. I mean, it's 84% of respondents around Europe, and we had close to 500 responses from 45 European countries that thought the European higher education area, the Bologna process, is really very important to them. So saying that, where do we actually stand? And to try to answer your question, did the Bologna process achieve its goals? And the answer is probably, well, you could say either the glass is half full or half empty. So if we look back where it started 25 years ago and where we are now today, so it's probably fair to say where it has had achievements. So we have transformed the degree system. If you look back on how degrees looked before Bologna, nowadays it's everywhere about bachelor and master's degrees and PhD degrees. So a fairly similar structure, even if it is credit-wise slightly different defined, but we all use the ECTS credits. I think we still have a number of programs which are not in the Bologna scheme, in particular in professional disciplines like medicine, pharmacy, and some engineering disciplines. But overall, I think that is something that has been achieved. A real success story that is also known beyond Europe is clearly the European approach to quality assurance. If we look back some 25 years, many countries didn't have a national QA agency, and nowadays we are looking at practically all or most countries have a QA agency, and we also developed a joint approach towards QA. We have the ECHA, the European QA Register. We have the standards and guidelines. So I think that's really a good success story. And also, as we advanced on transnational recognition of credits and degrees, the Lisbon Recognition Convention, the ECTS, is in place. For the social dimension, we can clearly say that this didn't exist some 20 years ago in most countries, and there has been increased attention given to inclusiveness and equity. And we made progress on transnational mobility and cooperation across Europe and beyond. So it's not just about Europe, but there are also things that we managed to extend to other parts of the world. And last but not least, I think we are not just visible as individual countries, but we are really visible as the European higher education area. And that also is useful for the attractiveness of studying in Europe and for participating and collaborating with European higher education institutions. So that's the success. But on the other hand, you could probably also say, and this is the half-empty part, that it is a partial success. So if we look at statistics, we cannot see any significant change in the participation of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. They are still underrepresented. If we look at mobility, we have set in 2009-10 a benchmark of 20% of graduates to have a mobility experience. We did not even achieve the mobility benchmark by half. When we talk about recognition, we asked in the trends report that I referred to before about have your students problem with credit recognition? And I think there's only 1 out of 5 higher education institutions which says there is no problem with the credit recognition of returning students. On a mechanism which exists basically since the mid-1980s. Automatic recognition, I think there are quite many countries in Europe which have established it, but asking the higher education institutions, we have the feeling it's not yet fully arrived there, what exactly that means, and we could say the same about recognition of prior learning. And I mean, grosso modo, it's probably right to say we have many policy reforms and instruments established, developed and established, but they have not yet everywhere implemented systematically. That would be the analysis. But then another point, and I think that relates to what Rector Ferreira has also pointed to, is it just about whether the glass is half empty or half full, or is it also about what is still in the bottle and how to fill it up? And that gets me to what we should probably discuss here also today about what is the potential for the continued relevance of the Bologna process, and within also for the continued relevance of higher education institutions. And this is about responses to change. And as the rector has just emphasized, increasingly, we are not just looking at degrees, and our feeling is degrees, they will continue to exist. But we are also looking on the rise of non-degree education on micro-credentials and similar formats. We have not seen any relevant answer to the digital developments in the Bologna process. The question is also on how mobility and internationalization changes. We have now a European benchmark of 23%, which recognizes blended mobility, which we think is an important step forward. If you look at the Bologna communiques over the past years, they all reference the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think as the European higher education community and also as the Bologna process, we have not yet found a joint way of responding to the SDGs. I think a positive, from looking at it positively, I think there is the capacity for change. Looking at the structures that we have developed in the Bologna process, with the Bologna follow-up group, with working groups operating under the Bologna follow-up group, we have and a regular report on the achievements and on the non-achievement as well. I think we have established a systematic structure for transnational collaboration on higher education policy reforms, and I think that's very good. And then importantly, a second element here is that we also find a way at least to co-fund some of these work through the Erasmus Plus program, looking at the international comparison and similar regional processes. What is usually missing there is a joint approach then for how to fund activities. And so we have ways of taking joint action, and I think that should go beyond the ministry, and we need probably more cross-structural initiatives that involves ministry, but also institutions, and is done at the European level. And I think the example that had been pointed to as of the European alliances is an interesting model that could probably be extended also to other areas of the policy reform. So that would be my last point then here. How could we use the Bologna process and the structures that we have better? I think we should really look more at a scope for exploring and mainstreaming innovation, and then also find new shared solutions. This was it from me as an introduction, and I'm looking forward for being here today and with discussing the issue with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Malcolm. And now we are going to hear Kete Sherifin.
Well, good morning, everyone. A warm word also to the rector, and thank you very much for the invitation. And especially to congratulate the University of Aveiro for keeping up the attention on the Bologna process. By the way, you know, many of us have noticed that this year would be the 25th anniversary. And if it wasn't by the University of Aveiro, probably wouldn't have this discussion. And also, by the way, you know, 5 years ago, Aveiro did a celebration about the 20th anniversary. So, you know, it's very important as rector, you know, that you're always rector. Rector Júlio Pedrosa was saying the University of Aveiro has a history on this process. So I think it's very important that some institutions keep up reflecting about, in many ways, what I would venture saying it's Bologna 3.0. So I think that's one of the difficulties. So I'll be brief because we don't have much time. And probably I will not go into detail in some of the parts of the slides. They're mainly sort of the structure, the reflection. The two main points that I would like to make to start with is that, well, when you invited us, you asked, well, what has been achieved? And one of the difficulties in answering that question is that there are different Bolognas, and Bologna has evolved over time. So in fact, we can say, well, you know, Bologna has achieved this and that, which was in the original declaration, but our understanding what Bologna means has changed over time. And that's why, for instance, one of the things that I will do is remember what were the initial, and I'm looking at sort of Salgril because he normally says that I've heard so many nonsense said about Bologna, and I signed this, and I don't remember that this was included in the declaration. So I think he probably shares some of these concerns. The second point that I'd like to make to start with is that Bologna, in many ways, the Bologna Declaration and the Bologna process is part of a context in higher education, but also a context in Europe. And actually, in the initial version of these slides, I actually had one slide comparing sort of landmarks or milestones in 1999 and 2024. And it's a very different world. And in many ways, I look back what I said 5 years ago. I was saying to Professor Sanders was, I'm far less optimistic than I was 5 years ago. And I tend to be an optimist, but it's been much more difficult nowadays to be an optimist. Now we're having a bit of that. Okay. So let's move forward. I talked about context, so I will focus more on the context of higher education itself, but I strongly recommend you to go back and Google what are the milestones in which world we were in 1999. And I hope you'll not feel as pessimistic as I feel when you compare what are the milestones nowadays. And of course, one major issue for the Bologna Declaration was the so-called Sorbonne Declaration. And one of the concerns, most of you know this, this was signed by the ministers of education of the 4 largest countries at that time in the European Union. And there was a word that, for those of you familiar with European issues, that has become a forbidden word, which was harmonization. And actually, one of the tensions that was always part of the Bologna process is how much emphasis do we put on harmonization? How much need do we have of harmonizing structures? Because the reality at that time in higher education across Europe was, as Michael was saying, very, very different and very diverse. And it still is in many ways. So that's another argument for Michael's comment of the half empty, half full. Yes, we have converged in many ways, but there's still a lot of differences. And one of the difficulties here is that education has been, since the Treaty of Rome, a national competence. So although the European Union was tempted to increasingly to intervene in education in general and in higher education specifically, at that time, this was already a tense point. Nowadays, I would say it's probably even more problematic, given the development that we had in many European countries, given the political, social, economic, cultural dimensions of education. This has become even a more sensitive issue. So I think that's always been a focus of tension. And by the way, and many of you remember Professor Mastalguru, for instance, could tell a few stories about the backdrop negotiations, who would sign what, and to what extent the Commission could be part of the process, and to what extent nation states have always resisted to this, and the ways that the Commission has found to go around this, and to intervene in the process. The Bologna Declaration also in many ways is also part of a broader context of regulation of the system. And one of the aspects that I think is very important is the type of relationship that we want to have between government and institutions. And Rector of the University of Aveiro already alluded to it. And one of the aspects that I think we tend to forget, and then Michael already emphasized it, is that quality assurance was one of the cornerstones of the Bologna Declaration, and it actually became. In many ways, it's one of the most visible dimensions of Bologna, and this has changed a lot, the way we think about education, and it has influenced in some positive ways, in some less positive ways. Okay, let's, Michael already mentioned many of the aspects that was in the specific aspects in the Bologna Declaration. I'm only listing this here because, we've discussed this so many times in different ways that we tend to forget what was the original declaration. And I'm also putting this because what we nowadays, if we do a sort of, we don't have time, but if we could do a sort of bit of an exercise now and say, what the Bologna process means for each of us, probably we would get very different answers. And we'll get, and this was influenced by the fact that the Bologna process was a dynamic process, a dynamic political process, but also a dynamic institutional process for many universities across Europe. You'll find the issues about, a mechanism of comparable and readable degrees. The use of comparability is actually tries to replace the issue of harmonization. So it's the idea that you keep identities and specificities, but you try to make them more comparable through mechanisms of learning recognition and so on. And the issue of mobility, which was also very crucial. Quality assurance I already mentioned. Mike already alluded to something that was not so much present in the discussion, but I think it's also relevant for some of the discussions that we have about not only about higher education, but about Europe, which is the global relevance of Europe. One of the things that was always very much present. And how do we achieve this? What kind of strategies do we promote to promote this global relevance of European higher education? And I will have something more to say about this further on. As I need to be brief, just 2 slides about what I think has been achieved, what has been the Bologna process and how this has evolved. Actually, what I did when preparing this was going through the trend reports from the beginning. I didn't look actually at the last one because I expected that Michael would probably do this because this was published this year. And it's also actually a very interesting exercise, and I strongly recommend if you're interested in the topic to see how the agenda has evolved, how the concerns have changed, and what we mean by Bologna is also reflected in those trend reports that were published more or less every 2 or 3 years, and they're mapping the process. There is, as you know, there was an initial enthusiasm about this. One of the things that I think made this process much more complex is that Bologna became embedded, and that relates to the comment that I was alluding to before. It became embedded in a wider set of European policies, but also national policies. A lot of governments took over the Bologna process and tried to adapt it to its reality, tried to adapt it to other policy objectives that existed. There is a lot of academic literature actually mapping this, and that each government tried to translate this, but also tried to use the Bologna process as an excuse or as an instrument to move forward an agenda that in many ways was a national agenda. And one of the difficulties also in saying what has been achieved is because different countries have different understandings of Bologna and set up in some ways additional objectives for the Bologna process. And I would say, if I can use a sort of more loaded word, also it has contaminated the Bologna process by other concerns that in some ways have distracted us from the major things. One aspect that was also very often mentioned throughout, especially in the first decade, was the lack of institutional autonomy, how much of this was top-down, especially in the first decade, and how much of this was achieved without financial support for institutions. The idea that you can transform higher education systems and institutions without any additional resources is, well, talking about optimism. It's in many ways, it's nonsensical, but it was the way it was done. And actually, in the case of Portugal, that was very much the case. If you remember, we had this challenge that we will transform the way we teach and learn, but no extra money. And I think that also explains a lot of the dissatisfaction, a lot of frustrations that some people associate with Bologna. One of the aspects I mentioned there before about the global relevance, and I would like to emphasize this now. One of the tensions that emerged with the construction of the European higher education area was this concern about, well, on the one hand, we want to integrate this, and we want to create a broader European space of higher education. But at the same time, we know that a more integrated space, as an economist I would say, a more integrated market is a concentrated market. So the risk of stratification and polarization in Europe has increased. And if we go back to the discussion we had 5 years ago, that was already one of the concerns that I had. With the political and social context that we have nowadays, I think this has become an even stronger concern. The risk that the Bologna process is seen or is perceived or is used as an opportunity to concentrate resources in some pockets of excellence because of the argument, for instance, of global relevance, the idea that we want to have European champions or national champions, and therefore we need to concentrate resources, financial resources, talent, and so on and so forth. We need to award a special status for some institutions, and therefore the landscape becomes much more stratified and becomes much more unequal. And I think that's one of the areas of concern. I think the construction and the consolidation of the European higher education inevitably created this or exacerbated this tension, but this was never very much discussed. And this is further exacerbated by the fact that the funding models have tried to become more and more enthusiastic about the idea of excellence, the idea of concentrating resources both at the European level, look at the European Research Council, but also at the national level, in a few institutions. The idea that we cannot fund everyone in lavish ways, so therefore we need to concentrate resources in just a few institutions that will be the ones that will compete at the international level, that will be able to attract to Europe, talent regarding students, regarding researchers and academics. And I think this introduced contradictions into the idea of the European higher education area and into the idea, for instance, of having more and more cooperation across European higher education. Regarding quality assurance, I already mentioned about this. There would be a lot that we could say. One of the things that I would highlight is that in many ways we've seen between, I would say, Bologna 1.0 and Bologna 2.0, let's say the first decade and the second decade, an evolution where in the first installment, we had a much greater emphasis on accountability and external dimensions of quality assurance. And in the second stage, we have moved more into enhancement and the concern that how much quality assurance and even accreditation can contribute to focus institutions more on internal quality assurance and internal quality improvement. And the last remark that I will make here, in order to move forward, is the relationship between the European higher education area and the European research area. And one of the major concerns that I have here is that we talk about this as they are separate realities, where in fact, for most of our systems, they should be connected. But the way they should be connected is also a question that needs to be discussed. What kind of relationship, what kind of interaction we want between higher education and research? And one of the concerns that I have, and I already alluded this with the discourse about, excellency and competition and so on, is that the higher education area becomes subordinated to the European research area. The idea that research is the one that, sets the tone in terms of reputation, and therefore, higher education institutions should subordinate its priorities to research and to the kind of benefits and prestige that is associated with research. And I think there is a risk that the European research area actually tends to dominate a lot of the dynamics in the European higher education area. I need to move forward to conclude. I will just say a few brief words in terms of teaching and learning. One of the things that I think has been very, very interesting in the second decade or the second half of these 25 years is that we moved from the discussion that was very much focused on formal and structural issues. The length of degrees, if you go back to the discussions we had in the early 2000s, was very much, how lengthy should be the first cycle and the second cycle, how comparable. All this discussion about, let's say, formal structures of education and learning. And more we became more focused in terms of the software, less of the hardware and more on the software. And the idea that, we need to more focus about what are the dimensions of learning, how much are we willing to change in terms of pedagogical dimensions, in terms of curricular dimensions. And I think in many ways, the discussion became much more interesting, certainly more complex. But one of the challenges about how much have we achieved is because, the agenda has shifted from these, let's say, more formal structural aspects to more of these issues about learning and content and purpose of higher education. And I think that has become more challenging. It has certainly become more challenging at the national level because most of the governments have struggled more to have a clear strategy in this respect. And this also contributes to move the Bologna process agenda and the discussion more to the institutional level and in this respect. I will just emphasize one aspect that the Rector of Aveiro already mentioned in the beginning, that I think is clearly one of the weak spots of all this evolution, which is lifelong learning. And I think particularly, this was already very relevant 5-6 years ago, but it has become even more relevant nowadays with developments in terms of artificial intelligence. The expectation that this will impact in people that are already in the labor market, people that used to have very established professional careers, and suddenly will be affected by many of these transformations. We have, the insights that we get from research going on is that a lot of the impact will be on people that are more educated, contrary to the previous ways of technological development and progress. Therefore, we need to have a response. And I think one of the critical issues for this next phase in terms of Bologna would be how much, in terms of our relevance as institutions and sector, how much we will be able to respond to this. Okay, I need to wrap up. I leave just a few questions. I know that we were supposed to look more backwards, but I'll leave some questions about, taking stock, what we need to do, or what I think are the concerns that we should be saying. I'll be very brief, so I'll basically enunciate The first is that over the last 10 years, we had really a significant shift with a much greater focus on teaching and learning, the recognition of education, the recognition of teaching. How do we keep momentum on this at the national level, at the European level, but also at the institutional level? Given the fact that still what awards reputation and prestige to institutions and to academics is much more what happens in research and what happens in education. So, this cannot be working just on the basis of goodwill and enthusiasm. How do we keep the political and institutional momentum if we don't change all the other things? The second thing I mentioned already, the technological challenges and continuing education, so I will not elaborate further. I also already mentioned about, if we keep putting the pressure in terms of on the issues of performance and excellence, how do we balance this with the idea of cohesion at the national level, but also at the European level? How do we deal with, I mentioned context a few times, how we deal with the context that politically, socially surrounds higher education, that is much more polarized than it was 25 years ago, much less enthusiastic about the idea of international cooperation. And I actually put there populism, and I explicitly meant populism because they are of different sorts, but there are various concerns there. I don't have time to explore this, but I'll just enunciate. The concerns about institutional autonomy. From right and left, the attitude nowadays is much less congenial to the idea that institutions need autonomy. Some of them because they want to intrude in what we do, what we teach. In some cases, because they think that we are not sufficiently concerned with issues of equity and social cohesion, that we became too elitist. So, there are various motivations going around, but I would say the bottom line is that the political context is much more adverse to institutional autonomy and to the idea that we should leave freedom to institutions to perform their mission. And the final remark, I already mentioned it, so I'll just reiterate, is the idea that, how do we articulate this relationship between higher education and research and the development at the European level? And I think the fact that quite often when we discuss the European higher education area, we ignore or omit the European research area, I think for me, it's a matter of concern because things have been evolving. And the fact that the new commission that just took office a few days ago has separated for the first time in many years education and science, I think is a development that reinforces this concern. Thank you very much.
Bom, e agora temos o contributo da professora Rosa Vasconcelos. Por favor.
Well, good morning. I need to have the PowerPoint here. Well, good morning to all of you. I would like to thank the invitation to be here. 35 years ago, my role was not to form the ombudsperson, but was the pedagogical council. And I take part of a mission in the university that speak about the Bologna process and the role that students must have. The difference that they must have some student workers who want to have the students in the university beginning at 9 o'clock and then they can leave at 5 o'clock. That's one thing. The less contact hours and more independent work that they need to know. That was one thing that we work a lot to see how many weeks the students must have, how many contact hours, and how much workload the students have to do that. Well, in the engineering process, I was responsible for do that. But if we can for a master in 5 years, it's not so. It was easier than the other courses that were 5-year courses that must be with 3-year courses. Well, let me begin the presentation because my role now is from the ombudsperson and the president of the Portuguese network. I'm going to speak something about that. Well, what the Bologna process brought significant changes in the educational experience. The first of all, it was harmonization and mobility, that the degree system aligned with European education, it was very important to do so, that facilitates recognition of diplomas, allowing the great student mobility. That was something very important, and we have many supporting students that have the opportunity to have the advantage of programs like Erasmus+. The academic flexibility that we have the introduction of study cycles, the first cycle, PhD cycles, master cycles, and PhD cycles, has created clear and more flexible trajectories. Because when we have since 25 years, for instance, in engineering, we have the mechanical engineering. Now, some first cycle in mechanics, and then second cycle in mechatronics or some. Well, what they want to do, I think it becomes more flexible to do so, even in integrated masters. We don't have now at the moment, but in the first cycle, the student was some grading. Then we have the focus on skills and employability. That's the Bologna process, the transition to more beautiful results and skills. Because one thing that we must learn is was introducing the soft skills to the students. Because normally we have a professor, and the professor say something in the class, and we also with Bologna want to have the students more interventive. We want to hear students and not the students to listen to the professor. The role of students must change. That's one thing that for most of us, it was the most difficult thing, because we are adapting some kind of teaching and learning methodologies, and then we must change that methodology and put the turn in students. The student must be independent. We must give them some arms, something to work with them, and then to have something with the introduction of PBL, with the introduction of soft skills. As the rector of Aveiro told us, the micro-credential, unfortunately, only one school of engineering introduced that in their courses. They have one subject in the course that students must have some skills, some models. In soft skills, they must be in Erasmus programs, they must be in seminars, and all of them contribute to have their grade in one of the subjects. But it was only one school. Nowadays, I speaking with all schools, I said we must do something like the management school, make that in the meaning, because it's very important to do that kind of thing. Well, that will be the employability. Well, our challenge, because we continue to have the challenge. Well, one thing is accessibility and inclusion, because I'm as a good person, we are very, very concerned with this kind of subject. High costs, because we have insufficient funding for education in Portugal that creates some inequality on access of students. And from the almost person, we have some people that are really with some economic issues, even with the grants that they have had. Well, we have some students that don't have the chance to participate in mobility because the economic part. Well, I think that is something like in Portuguese, because if you speak with Swedish students and Norwegian students, they are going to work in their holidays to get some money to do their training. But I think in Portugal it's something that is called, so they don't have something about that. But one thing that we must work on, well, the limit inclusion, we have some the advantage with socioeconomic backgrounds, with migrant communities, and peripheral regions that have fewer opportunities to fulfill the benefits of all the reforms. Well, sometimes we have some, even we have one of our goals will be the connection with the labor market. We have some insufficient preparation because 3 years is not enough to have everything done in the first cycle. Well, we have the spike on focus on skills. Many students report that courses lack a stronger practical connection to job market, because it's not possible to have in 3 years the mini preparation of both students with 2 years of context. And we have also a problem with the professional recognition of our grades in some of the European countries. They don't recognize our grades when they are going to work there, as we have something as that challenge. And we have now what we say the academic pressures. Well, with everything, I think, and with the COVID, we have the mental health. has increased a lot. And when I speak with students, I told them that we must change their role after COVID, because they went to the university to have classes and they go home. They not stay in the university like they do before COVID. I think the attitude that they have at the moment is different, and we must change that. I don't know how, but I think is one thing that we have done, one challenge to do, and with not with Bologna, because Bologna is nowadays, but we need to prepare them to have more space, to have them in the university, to have more tasks to do, and to bring them to university, not to go there. Well, the professor for the future, well, one thing, unfortunately, our minister is not here, because one thing that is strengthening the financial support, because yesterday I have with a meeting with our social service, and I understand that a couple is when spend in the university, if they are the 8,020 euros per month, they only have funding only to pay the fee and only 80 euros for the lodging. Is not enough. We need to improve that, but our minister is not here, and I was talking about that, but I'm going to talk with him further. Well, the mobility grants must be also increased to have more for the people that have advanced backgrounds is very important. And as we tell, we must have the education more adapted to the needs of 21st century. Micro-credentials, we need to have the improvement of that in our process. More practical and connected curricula is very important. That means reinforce internships, interdisciplinary projects, and partners with local and international companies. If you want to be in Europe, you must do that. Sometimes in 3 years, that is the format is not enough, but I think we must work in that. Well, the digital and sustainable skills are now a moment to do that. We must prepare, well, nowadays I think maybe the students are preparing us with our digital skills, with the ChatGPT, with a single artificial intelligence, that we must prepare to how to assess the students, because we are going to use this kind of softwares out there. We must prepare how to have, we can assess the student, the skill that they have in the subjects that we are related. Well, another thing will be the mental health support, but I know that the government as well seems that they support some psychologists for all students that they want to apply. We have for nutrition, I don't know the consultant. I'll say that in English. We have 6 in nutrition and we have 12 in psychology. All students that can apply is one thing that they have put that, but and we have to work in inclusion and diversity. Because in diversity, we are not talking about gender, we are talking about the culture, we are talking about religion, we are talking about everything that are involved now in our education, and we are here now in Portugal. And now to finish, final remarks. Well, we must have more political and institutional commitment, trying to harmonize education systems and ensure inclusivity and accessibility. We must recognize the voice of students to know what they want to have more in their courses, and we must have a sustainability area. And another thing that our final remarks, I know that the European Union has developed some software that can recognize automatically all the grades of students that make some programs based on the percentiles of each of our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you left
Okay.
1 minute for
Oh.
questions. Please, who wants to question our speakers? Please. Aqui. Aqui.
Thank you so much. I found it very inspirational. And there was one word that especially sticks in my mind now, and this is harmonization. Because sometimes I'm the Brussels office of the European Consortium of Innovative Universities. Sometimes I can speak with the European member states, but before I speak with the member states, the Commission always tells me, Olga, whatever you say to them, don't use the word harmonization, because the member states will run out the door. They are afraid education is national competence. We cannot talk about harmonization. But listening to the two of you now, I realize this is so stupid. Because harmonization is not about losing national competence. It's about that we are stronger together. So I'm now really doubting. I always listen to the European Commission. I never use these words. But what if you would stand in front of the EU member states right now? Would you use this word harmonization? Can we convince them that harmonization is not scary? Can you help me building this argumentation? Because I think this is a key difficulty that we have now.
Excellent. Somebody else down the room? No? Oh, hello. Lá no meio da sala.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is George. Thank you so much for the presentation and sharing. I'm very enthusiastic about it. I have a very concrete question that is, after Bologna process, we saw some countries enshrining in their higher education laws or related laws the position of ombudsperson for student or for university members. My question is, did, in your opinion, this Bologna process influence the implementation of this position in education institutions? If so, why and how? Thank you.
Thank you. On your right. Yes, the person on your right. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Portugal from FAIR Portugal, the institution that represents externally the students from higher education. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to bring to the topic one of the topics I would say that is more important is the question of the alliances of higher education institutions, in the sense of how can they bring this problematic word of harmonization, because in the national level, some countries give the same funding for the institutions. In the example of France, for example, they give the same funding that they get from the alliance itself. So it's very complicated. And in the case of Portugal, there is no funding added from the national government to the alliances. I say this in the sense that how is it possible to have an harmonization within EU if we could create programs, for example, with master programs, joint master programs. We now are talking about a European degree label. And I would like to ask you, how do you think it is possible with such alliances to bring this kind of harmonization? Thank you.
I have also one question for you. How do you bring in the question of the CPLC, the community of Portuguese-speaking countries? I was asked sometime years ago by the University of Mozambique with Eduardo Mondlane to go there and tell them what was this of the European higher education program for higher education institutions. So please inscribe that in your agenda. But it's your time to answer the question, please. Please, Mike. Mike, please.
Sorry, the sound is not always very clear on my side, so I couldn't understand your question, but I tried to answer probably two of the questions. The first one that came from Olga about harmonization, I think you're right there. And I mean, as I'm one of the veterans in the Bologna process by now, probably just to refer that in the past, we sometimes used convergence. So we talked about convergence rather than on harmonization. But I think it doesn't make so much difference because it could be about the same. I think what's probably more important is that we should be clear on where we want to harmonize or converge, where does it actually create an added value to have a shared instrument or a shared approach or a defined standards, and where it doesn't. And I mean, if we look at the discussion on the electric plugs, I think that's a clear situation where we all see the advantage, do we? And I think another point that I want to make here, the other side of it is, of course, grant the institutions sufficient autonomy so that they can take up what they actually think is useful, is a good approach for them. And I think that's definitely, I think we have to find a balance between these two. I mean, thinking of what should be a common standard, a common approach, but leave enough space for implementation and grant the institutions sufficient autonomy. The other question I wanted to ask, to answer on briefly, is about the alliances. And I think you are absolutely right, but probably you're just experiencing in a very harsh way, maybe what is anyhow a situation in the higher education area, depending on what country you come from. You may have less good or better funding possibilities. And indeed, there is a difference also how the alliances are treated and the argument is often also related to the national funding approach. I know, for example, those countries which allocate lump sum fundings to their institutions, they would say the institutions have already been supported and we can't create more unevenness among the institutions in the sector. But I think what I wanted to add here, a way of how I can see the alliances to contribute is really that on many of the things that we addressed also through the Bologna reforms and on other issues that we would just take on granted, the alliances actually explore what that means in institutional practice. I mean, you can always make some students mobile. You find ways around the obstacles that you will find. But if you want to do that in a more mainstream fashion, then you run into the difficulties. And I think this is what I see as beneficial there. And also that the alliances go beyond the project approach. So we explored already the differences and the obstacles through projects. But I think we do this now through the alliances in a more long-term and holistic, with a more holistic perspective. And I think I find that despite the fact what you might think what comes out of it and how sustainable they will be in the future, but in this very moment I find that very useful. And I also think that it stimulates really our policy making and the debates that we have about policy making. And I think it's also probably one of the reasons why, as I showed on my first slide, the Bologna process is so highly valued at the moment. I think we realize also in the alliances that we confront obstacles, but we can also work together because of a joint language and shared instruments that have been developed in the Bologna process, despite the fact that they are not everywhere understood exactly the same way and that they are not everywhere yet implemented. So that's from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Well, I am talking about harmonization, that what we think about harmonization. It was only by the duration of the courses. Because if possible, we need 5 years to examine the first degree. And in all Europe, we know this was 3 years to have DST. We don't have DST for the Iniciativa, but all the grades was 5 years. Well, we have technical grades that was 3 years, but most of the That's what we call from harmonization. Why in Europe we need only 3 years to have the first degree, and in Europe we need the 5 years? That's what the harmonization is not to be the skills that the course have, because the number of years that the students must have to achieve their degree. And that's, I think we do something, and we are similar in the whole Europe. Even I think in Spain it's 4 years in some courses. But I think in most of Europe, 2 years that they can achieve PhD and 2 years for master's. And we have master's for 1 year only, and 2 years for PhD. Well, trying to answer John's question, my colleagues from almost person also, I think we almost that became only with our PhD. I have never seen writing about the Bologna process to have the person in the university. Well, for my knowledge, I think that begins only with PhD 50 years ago. That all the higher institution has to have person in there. I don't think that was not with the Bologna. Well, I don't think, but I don't know really. About the joint master programs about the Alliance, at the moment I think there are a lot of joint degrees from Erasmus, because I think it's in Portugal we have 25 programs that allows a lot of universities from Portugal, well, they have some joint alliances at Solar, because we have been together with students so that they have another kind of alliance. I think in all of them they have 65 alliances that we can prepare to joint degrees. Because joint degrees, they are in the field. We have that also. And with students from our foreign countries, well, CLC, we have the problem of economics. We have the problem with economics, we have the problem with visa, not even all understand if they are easier to get, but with Guinea, it's awesome. Well, but that is not concerning about Bologna. That is concerning when they come here, they arrive in most of the university, well, for my knowledge, from Guinea in second semester. This 1 year that they are going to Toulouse. And the one thing that we have also with Bologna, and so people know that was the year 0, because their knowledge are not similar to the knowledge that our students have here. And the year 0, the previous year, it was very important to those students that can have achieved their goals better. Because there are some difficulties in studying. They have difficulties of economic difficulties, because most of them, they have the grant from the government, but it is not on time. And then they have some problems in lodging. And one thing that we have all the universities in Portugal that we have discussed them in our network, we don't have lodging that is enough for all the students that have a grant. If they are a grant from our government, even so, we don't can have a room to give them. That's a problem that we must have if we have here the students in 3 years in the cycle that are is short. We must try to do to solve that kind of problem. This is another challenge.
Okay. Difficult questions. I'll try to be very brief, but try to touch on the 4 points. The first, harmonization. I would try to avoid this because I think one of the concerns that I have in European debates is that we get entangled in semantic discussions, and then we don't progress. So I think that's in many ways very sensible, precisely because it's a process. So I can understand that some of things that 25 years ago would not be acceptable then become more accessible because of the degree of collaboration. Having said that, I would raise 2 caveats. The first one is harmonization of what? Because we started this debate 25 years ago on harmonization of degrees, not formal structure, but one of the concerns is the harmonization of curriculum, for instance. And if we go to debates about the Halo, for instance, and this kind of learning outcomes standardization. I think that's a matter of concern. Second caveat, just to give an illustration, 3 years ago, I was part of one of the debates of the Conference for the Future of Europe. And I was invited to Strasbourg to talk on education. And then we were supposed to attend small group discussions about, as you know, you probably know how it was the process. There was a sample of European citizens that were selected randomly to be a representative sample. And one of the things that struck me is that quite often in many of the groups, there was this concern that Europe is trying to impose a certain view through the education system. So, and I think this matter is now more sensitive than it was 25 years ago. So I would be very careful, and the fact that universities are not perceived as detached from the society in which they are embedded and in the political debate. So this would be a much longer discussion, but I think we need to be careful, and I especially that words don't get into on the way of progressing. Second thing, in terms of the role of the ombudsperson, I'll just add something to what Professor Rosa said. I think the fact that Bologna put much more emphasis on teaching and learning, student success and student satisfaction, I think, and student-centered learning debate, I think has clearly contributed to enhance the role of the ombudsperson, and that's why it's not surprising that when we had the revision of our regulatory framework, this was established as something that all institutions should have. Again, we could discuss more about this, but I need to shut up. The minister is already waiting there and standing for him. Third thing on the alliance is I'll pretend that I didn't see him, so I will speak very freely. Don't listen to this part now. I think it's clearly an illustration of the fact that we are having this discussion about funding separately between higher education and science. So for me, it's a matter of concern that we have a strategy of internationalization of science that doesn't look about what is happening in higher education. And the fact that, if the European alliances are supposed to be a central issue in the development of our sector, and this I think is very important because we have more than 2/3 of our public universities and polytechnics are already part of one alliance. If this is so important and this is supposed to be transformative, what kind of resources do we put? And I'm also saying, because as ministers also an economist like myself, so we don't believe in things that happen just by the matter without funding and without revenues. And I think we need to rethink, and I will not discuss the issues of the American partnerships, but because it would be a delicate issue, but it's clearly an example about how do we connect these two things, and I think that's clearly one concern. Final remark about the Lusophone countries. Just two quick things. One, to a large extent, I think this is one dimension of the success of the Bologna process. The fact that many countries beyond the European Union, many countries beyond Europe, looked at the Bologna process and tried to adjust their degree structure. As you know, the number of signatory countries much beyond the European Union. And I think that's clearly one of the signs of achievement of the Bologna process that has an impact, and of the global relevance of European higher education. And I would actually highlight that in the case of the Lusophone countries, one dimension where this is progressing is, for instance, accreditation. We mentioned that quality assurance was a very crucial issue, and I'm seeing Professor Maria João Rosa there, and she's just here and coordinated a study with the CPLP on the mapping the activities of all quality assurance agencies in the Lusophone speaking countries. So that's actually a sign of how there's much more, and this came out of a willingness to collaborate and coordinate between the agencies that are being developed in each of the Portuguese-speaking countries on quality assurance in higher education, and how they can, and we need this collaboration to structure much more cooperation between the institutions, because you need to create some common ground in order, for instance, to foster mobility, recognition of learning, joint degrees, and so on and so forth. So I think there are interesting developments on this matter, but as well, I profit to make some publicity, but I think it's much more.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Eduardo, but we were too long. Thank you. Have a break now, please.
Welcome back. The Bologna process is driven by an ambition that's always renewed, adding new objectives and goals. The ideas behind the European Universities Initiative or the micro-credentials movement are two examples of this. What needs to be done to accomplish what remains unfinished, and what are the new challenges ahead? To discuss this issue, we'll have the following speakers. Anthony F. Camilleri, policy consultant, project manager and quality and standardization expert, who will be participating via Zoom. Iris Kimizoglu, president of the European Students' Union, and Olga Wessels, head of the European Consortium of Innovative Universities Brussels office, and with the moderation of Eduardo Marçal Grilo, member of the board of trustees of the University of Aveiro, Minister of Education in office when the Bologna Declaration was signed.
Well, His Excellency, our Minister of Education, Sr. Reitor, first of all, let me just start by congratulating the University of Aveiro for the initiative, which I think is very relevant for the discussion and for the debate about the future in terms of higher education. And let me say this, I will start saying this. The Bologna Declaration was a political document, was not a technical document, was a political declaration that was, Peter Teixeira describes here all the history. I'm not going to the details of the preparation of the Bologna Declaration. The Bologna Declaration is a long story. I wrote it in an article in a review, an English review some years ago. And I'm not going into those details. Since 1999, I should say that I'm not aware of the details of the development of this. So what has been said in the previous meeting is something that for me is entirely new. So all the problems of mobility and evaluation and accreditation and so on is something that I'm not dominating at the moment. For this meeting, what we are asked, or you are asked, to talk about what remains unfinished in what relates to the Bologna Declaration, as well as what are the new challenges for the universities and for the Bologna Declaration in political terms. My feeling as a moderator is not to introduce any new subject, but I'm going to share with you what is really my main concern. My main concern is this. We are living in a very delicate moment in political terms, not in Portugal, but in Europe and in the world as a whole. If we look into the United States or to the Middle East or to Ukraine or to the Southeast Asia, we can see that we have a kind of a political mass. And this political mass will bring us, I think, and this political mass will have quite a lot of effects. It will affect very much the university system, as well as all of us in all terms, in social terms, in cultural terms, and in what regards the day-by-day life of each one of us. So this is my main concern. In this political mass, what can be asked to the universities in the next future? What they should do, how they should act, because the future is very unpredictable. And the answer to unpredictability is probably, and my challenge to you, is to reinforce the cooperation between universities. It's to increase everything that relates to talent, science, with innovation, and with knowledge. So the university system in Europe, so what is called the higher education European area, is something that started not in the Bologna Declaration, not in the Sorbonne Declaration, but in a meeting that took place in Brussels in 1996, when the Minister of Education from Netherlands, Joe Witsen, a good friend of mine, introduced the idea of a higher education European area. That I should say is the root of the Bologna Declaration. And when we talk by talking one with each other, and we think on this. If that declaration, if the Bologna Declaration is a success in some areas, it's a failure in other ones. So probably you have identified what are the unfinished remains of the Bologna Declaration. My main concern, let me just add this. Europe is now very concerned with the defense problem. And everybody is trying to invest in weapons, in soldiers, in tanks, in planes, in missiles, in drones. And this will affect education. This will affect the social welfare in Europe. Definitely. If we start looking, if we start trying to ask the bank to bring more money to Brussels, and to the bureaucracy, all the bureaucracy that is in Brussels, is a quite strong element of this. It is true. I'm not avoiding the reality of this. And even if the banks are prepared to invest in Europe, my concern is we probably will have difficulties on what respect to the funding of education, health, social welfare, and so on, not only education. So this is my main concern. For the future, we can look into the big challenges. This is a big challenge in science, right, to describe. And for this, we need to reinforce the role of the university. I am not optimistic. I don't have a catastrophic view of the education, but I'm concerned. So I'm talking to you, I'm sharing with you, I'm trying to share with you my concern and listen to our three speakers. Our first speaker is Anthony Camilleri. He is a policy consultant, project manager, and quality and supervision expert. He is online. Welcome to the meeting. Anthony, please take the floor. Are you listening to me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Sorry, of course, my computer had to freeze the second you called on my name. Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, although I would have loved to spend some time in Aveiro. And I'd just like to share a few thoughts with you about the role of micro-credentials and what this might mean for the future of the Bologna process. If we look at how the landscape overall of education is changing, I would say that there are three trends that are important to talk about. The first is how micro-credentials are increasingly becoming a tool for what we used to call virtual mobility. The second is how quality assurance procedures are evolving and resulting in a kind of new trust landscape. And also, I think it's important that we talk about the concept of recognition and how more and more recognition means different things when you ask an employer or when you ask an academic institution. So first of all, some numbers on micro-credentialing. It's important to say that there is no high-quality data collection on this. So this is a little bit of a combination of statistics taken out of different reports. But the last numbers I could find was that 33 European university alliances are currently implementing or planning to implement micro-credentials, and that's from a 2023 report, while 14 European countries have policies on the recognition of micro-credentials, with 8 more discussing. You look at those numbers and you say, okay, micro-credentials are growing quickly. Everyone in higher education is doing something about it. But actually, if you look at, let's say, the types of implementations that are happening, what you find is that, let's say, a lot of these implementations are very much in the early stages. So within your typical university alliance, you might find micro-credentials being used to build a learning pathway that crosses multiple institutions. You might call it a light joint degree of some sort. You find that they're used very often to experiment with new learning methodologies in a low-risk way. And for certain fields, in particular when it comes to courses like AI, you do see institutions using them to deploy teaching offers more rapidly. However, if you read the EU recommendation on micro-credentials and you read introductions and so on about the promise of micro-credentials, the promise of micro-credentials was supposed to be able to upskill adult learners at scale. It was supposed to be about increasing diversity and inclusion of our education systems. And I think most of you would have to agree with me that at least within higher education, we are not really seeing micro-credentials having that kind of impact as of yet. But in other areas, we are seeing it. So latest user numbers of LinkedIn Learning, 27 million monthly users globally, which basically makes them the largest educational institution on the planet. Another good number, 12 MOOCs with over 1 million users in 2022. Of those in 22, none were from the EU. I tried to update this number, and I do have to call out one European university. So we have managed to do 1 over 1 million MOOC, which is the elements of AI being offered by the University of Helsinki. Even though we look at those numbers, if you look at them a little bit more closely, this is a very, very important disclaimer. Of the top 250 MOOCs, again, according to Class Central, only 3% of those MOOCs are considered advanced level MOOCs. And generally, if you are a person that considers the role of higher education to provide advanced level studies, then there's a lot of room to grow when we're talking about advanced level studies in micro-credentials. And possibly one of the reasons advanced micro-credentials are slow is because it takes longer and it's harder to deploy an advanced level micro-credential than to deploy a beginner's level micro-credential. But still, the question I would just ask you all to think about is the focus on virtual mobility and really using micro-credentials just for virtual mobility between alliances distracting from the real purpose of micro-credentials, which is to extend higher education into lifelong learning, to extend higher education into adult learning, and not just slightly different variations of our current degree programs. Within that idea, and while talking about university alliances and thinking about quality, I just ask you, is this easy to understand? I know a few of you work for university alliances, and honestly, I don't envy you the job of explaining what university alliance is to a student. With this combination of logos, with this combination of brands, as a student, how do I know a micro-credential offered by one of these things is a quality micro-credential? When you're talking about a university that has a history, that has a location, that has a place, it's much easier to describe rather than these, let's say, collection of logos and newfangled creatures. And that does bring us to the platform issue, which in particular we are suffering from in Europe. And simply, if I ask you, where do I go to find trusted micro-credentials from European universities? I can go to the websites of the alliances, but is there a single spot or even a single 2 or 3 spots where I can find the trusted micro-credentials from European universities? I wouldn't know where to go. And outside of Europe, the role of platforms has become very, very important. Companies like Coursera, companies like edX, government-run MOOC platforms like Swayam in India. Again, if you look at, I think now the top 7 global MOOC platforms, not one of them is European. And increasingly, not only do you see, let's say, large-scale micro-credential MOOC providers offering things online, but increasingly they are creating, let's say, selected packages of their best micro-credentials, which they apply extra quality assurance to, and those are then remarketed either as business subscriptions or even sold to governments in parts of the world to be able to, let's say, look, here is 200 or 300 of our best micro-credentials, which can be offered as a package. And what we start seeing here is platforms not only operating as hosts of micro-credentials, but they are beginning to have a role in quality assurance, and they're actually acting as gatekeepers for micro-credentials. And this role of gatekeeping of platforms is something that we, let's say, haven't really started discussing of what we want to do about it. One more thing to talk about is the importance of wallets. And many of you will have heard some version of the term skills-based hiring, of employers saying, we don't necessarily need a degree, we're willing to look at the skills people have, etc., etc. Generally, I am not in the camp of people who say that the era of the degree is over. Quite the opposite. I think degrees are needed more than ever. But it is fair to say that we are in a degree plus world, where your portfolio is made up of your degree plus a collection of micro-credentials you collect over a lifetime to be able to enhance that. And what that means is that we need agreed formats to be able to document learning achievement, because very often your achievement will not be represented anymore by a single document coming from a single institution, but it'll be represented from multiple documents coming from multiple institutions. And it'll be a mixture of big achievements like a multi-year degree and smaller achievements like a multi-week micro-credential. And if every one of those documents is in a different format, how can we possibly expect anyone to actually want to read through all of that data? So if we want to empower learners to show what they know and show it in detail, we need to think about more common formats for any kind of learning achievement, and not just say we have a diploma supplement, which is for a higher education degree, and for the rest of learning, it's the Wild West. Moving on a little bit to what employers care about, and this is from an interesting report that was commissioned by Coursera, and they were looking at what are the factors which are most important when students decide to earn a professional certificate. The interesting thing here is counting as credit towards my degree is not top of the list. Top of the list is that it's offered by an industry leading company. And I think just that, this is a small sample, it's only 2,500 people or so, but it's an interesting thing to think about, that people are valuing the fact that it's offered by a company more than it is the fact that a micro-credential counts as credit towards a degree. Linked to that, again, is one more statistic. 55% of green and AI job postings in the EU in 22 did not require a university degree. Many of them, I'm sure, hired with university degrees, but it wasn't necessarily a requirement. Last thing I want to show you, just in terms of, let's say, ideas and trends, is I've just taken a couple of snapshots of HR platforms. And this one is from SAP. And just what I want you to look at is the recommendations at the top and where those recommendations are coming from. So what this platform actually does is it looks at all your email, it looks at your Microsoft Teams activity, and based on all your chats and all your emails within your company, it actually recommends courses from the library which that HR platform is connected to. Here is another one, which just gives you an idea of kind of like the way skills monitoring is being done more and more in companies. You want to get a promotion. Here are the skills you have. Here's how you are evaluated on those skills from a mixture of your learning and from your job performance. So taking all these trends together, what do they mean for the Bologna process? First of all, if you look at those numbers, I would say that in terms of mass market kind of beginner micro-credentials, EU universities are already out of the market. You cannot compete with the 27 million learners of LinkedIn. You cannot compete with the tens of thousands of courses of the beginner providers. That isn't the role of universities. That isn't even something we should be trying to do. What the signals say clearly, though, is first of all, that the format of micro-credentialing is very, very attractive to users. And secondly, that there is strong demand for work-integrated programs and work-integrated programs that offer deep learning and high-quality assessment. And if you think about a university micro-credential as being something that has those characteristics, then that is something where there is demand, which there is still space for. In preparing for this, I had, let's say, a reminder read of the last of the Bologna communiques. And what I find interesting is that the last communique says very, very clearly that we reaffirm what we said in 1998. There are 3 cycles of higher education, and we continue to work on those 3 cycles. And then here and there, you'll find these paragraphs that say, oh, and there's this new micro-credential thing, and we should pay attention to it. I think we need to go beyond that in the conversation. So is it the role of universities to support you through lifelong learning throughout your lifetime? If the answer is yes, then really we should be talking about a 4th cycle of higher education that goes beyond the first 3, and not just having micro-credentials as an add-on we don't know where to put. If we believe that the role of universities stops with your degree, then we should also just say so and get out of the micro-credentials market. I'm going to assume we are interested in micro-credentials, otherwise my other 3 slides are useless.
Anthony, please,
yes?
please, 2 minutes, okay?
2 minutes is perfect. So if you look now, a lot of the alliances are looking at recognition in a lot of detail, and at the moment, recognition procedures are over bureaucratic. We don't have true automatic recognition even for degrees, let alone for micro-credentials. And at the moment, you see a lot of the alliances signing contracts to recognize each other's micro-credentials. If we want to grow micro-credentials, this needs to be a focus of Bologna. We need to get rid of this. On quality, we need to consider institutional accreditation as the default for micro-credentials. You cannot quality certify each micro-credential individually. And we need to think more about the role of platforms and start thinking, what is the role of platforms in our QA landscape? Finally, if we look at guidance and transparency, we need to look beyond the diploma supplement and find an agreement on what a digital diploma looks like and what is the format of a digital diploma. Very closely linked to that, micro-credentials only have value if they are considered official qualifications. For them to be official qualifications, they need to be included on qualification frameworks. And the last part of this puzzle, from my perspective, is that we need a single source of data on courses throughout the higher education area, a platform that brings together everything on micro-credentials. That's all I have for you for the moment. Thank you for attention. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Edith, please.
Do I go there or stay here? I don't have a question. Okay, then I will sit. Great. And I have my notes on my phone, so I'm not texting. It's just the millennial thing that we do now, not to have paper anymore. You do, but well. Yes, my name is Iris. I'm from the European Students' Union. We represent 20 million students, including the Portuguese Student Union that's also here today. And reflecting on the future of Bologna also requires a bit thinking about the past, right? And I've been wondering in the past years, now that I've been more deeply in the process, there's all the tools and all these commitments. And then I go to my university and I feel like half of it is not there. And I don't think I feel it like it is what it is. Half of it is not there. And what's the problem? But why is there an implementation gap? I think that's the biggest question. And here in the last 2 years, I feel like what I see is there's a communication issue. The first communication issue is the people that go to the Bologna process working structures from the ministries, for example, the people that go to the European Union working structures. Do they report back well into the ministry? And does the ministry then actually take this input and transform it into a strategic approach? But then even if that is the case, and I mean, for Portugal, I looked at the Bologna implementation report, so that's what your own ministry answered. There's no strategy on learning and teaching. There's no encompassing strategy based on the principle and guidelines on the social dimension. I hear that there's issues with the housing, for example, right now. That's quite big. There's no big strategy on how to implement the fundamental values. So, but even if you have that, what goes then down to the university level? What's communicated to the rectors' conferences, by the rectors' conferences to the universities, and then what gets to the professor on the individual level and the student? And it seems like it's not so much because, okay, on paper, we might have learning outcomes, we might have ECTS and so on, but do we all understand the same? Probably not. If you ask the professor, anyone here in the room, they give you 10 different answers what for them a learning outcome is, or how do you recognize something. So you asked in the beginning, what have we finished in the Bologna process? And I don't think there is anything that has been finished. And maybe it will never be because it's a process. But the issue is we're talking about commitments from almost 30 years ago that we still have not been able to implement. And here, what we can see in the last years is if there's clear commitments that are clearly communicated also by the public authorities, and this is the minister, this is the ministry, then there's much higher chances that something will be done and changed. But if the universities don't get that and they don't have the feeling that there's something that now urgently needs to be addressed and changed, then you get into this process of slowing down. And I think that's where we are right now. The big visions of Bologna have somehow ended, but this is what we need. We need ministries and public authorities that take back this process and say, okay, let's sit together with the national stakeholders and make sure that we finally implement what is there as a gap. And this commitment has been missing all over Europe at the moment. But yeah, so this is a general remark I would like to make. It's important that you create these processes where you reflect upon the Bologna process in the country with the stakeholders, and then to transfer this also to the university level. Bring your students together, bring your professors together, not only in the university senate, but create conferences like this that are public for the entire public of your university, because otherwise they will get the feeling the Europeans say something and suddenly we have to do it. But that's not the case. The Bologna process is a process that is steered by the countries, not by some random European person on an abstract level, right? Now, yeah, let's maybe have a quick look also in some of the commitments that we have. So the key commitments. Does Portugal have has it implemented micro-credentials in any way in legislation? Currently, no, from what I know. Lisbon Recognition Conventions. For now, you have 4 out of 5 points in the scorecard indication. So even almost 30 years or over, you still haven't fully implemented the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And here's where a lot of the problem starts. Because if we talk about recognition of prior learning, skills, learning outcomes, quality assurance, all these key commitments, a lot of this wouldn't be an issue if the Bologna tools would have been fully implemented. So we have a lot of problems, and we are spending a lot of resources on problems, even in the alliances, where the solutions are already clear, but what's lacking is the implementation. So we are losing a lot of money and resources and capacities and time by just not following up with our commitments, right? This year, the ECTS Users Guide will be reformed, and also the ESGs on quality assurance. And here's a lot of actors that say we need more, and we need clearer ideas and clearer guidance on how to do these things. But then there's reluctance very often from the public administrations to do that, because we are talking about harmonization. At the same time, nobody wants to lose control and competencies. But are we really fighting at the right spot then for control and competencies, or isn't forming synergies the way forward? So that's another reflection point. The fundamental values, it's a completely, more or less completely new thing. We have been working on this for a few years. Interestingly enough, for example, Portugal is saying academic freedom is implemented in the country, but in the constitution, it doesn't say academic freedom. The wording is not there. You know, so even when you look in these implementation reports, you can see we are not using the same language, even though we are using the same language, or we are understanding them differently and then reporting we have something or we don't have something. And here, I think I want to highlight that the fundamental values are extremely important, because the public has lost trust in higher education and in research as well, and also in the teaching. And if we want to make sure that we are future-proofing higher education, we need to future-proof it also by having actually the rights of the academic community well protected in higher education laws. I know it's going to be reformed soon. Maybe this is a good place to start. For learning and teaching, learning outcomes, we are still not recognizing skills based on learning outcomes. We are still looking at, does the ECTS number match? Does the title of the course match? We are not looking, has the learning outcome actually be achieved? But this is the key, that we need to have micro-credentials also work. That's the key, that we need to have skills recognition in the future, prior learning and so on. And then maybe the last thing is, Bologna works because it's voluntary, because nobody wants to give the competencies on education to a higher level. And I think that's fine, actually. That's not the issue. But it also does not work because of this. And that makes it a very tricky process, right? If this thing that makes it work is the same thing that doesn't make it work, how do you deal with it? Our student unions, we asked them this year in the Bologna the Student Eyes report that we bring out every 3-4 years. Do you think there should be consequences for countries if they don't implement the commitments? And almost all of them said yes. And this is not because students like to see institutions punished or countries punished, on the contrary, but it is because we see that apparently something is going wrong and it's not being addressed properly. And as long as there's no consequence, people are just floating around that would have the power to change it. So I'm not saying you should think about how to have consequences of non-implementation, but what I'm saying is we really need the public authorities to step up and to steer again, together with the higher education institutions and the students in the country, how to move forward. And you start by creating a national strategy together. Then the second step is to have measures in place. You look into how you can measure it as well over the years. And if you see that something that you did not work out, you think about a new way. And if you did something that worked out, great, you have a step forward in the implementation. But you need to start with the implementation again and not pretend that it's already there, because it's not the case. And I think the room is full. There's a lot of people interested in that. So it's up to you as a minister maybe to take that back into your ministry and think about how can we bring Bologna back into Portugal, bring it forward, and then also bring this up to the level on the European level, because what I see in the Bologna process, and this, then I will end, is there is not many people anymore that come with a great passion and a great vision. And even at this year's ministerial, there were no ministers, which has some other problems behind it why this was the case. But we had a ministerial conference on Bologna 25 years without ministers, and that's a strong signal. And that's something we need to change. Bring back the vision, start dreaming again, and make them possible, because most of the things where we are saying, oh, it's not possible, really just regulations. You can change the regulation like that usually.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Let me just, before I give the floor to the next speaker, let me just take a very, very short comment and remark. We can say we have three levels of cooperation. One, it's level of the minister and the government, which is a very important one. The document that the Bologna Declaration was signed by the minister. And our minister is at the moment Minister also for university. So he's responsible for higher education. The second level is the level of university. And the cooperation between universities have an academic freedom and even a political freedom that can go beyond the relationship between the government. And the third one, which is also relevant, is at the level of the students. Because the interaction between the students will create a kind of network that works at the level of the student. And if we look into what happened in the last 25 years, we have already 1 million babies that were born under the Bologna, not the Bologna, the mobility that was raised by the Bologna Declaration. Okay, sorry for the comment. Please, you have the floor, Olga. You are coming from the European Consortium of Innovative Universities, from the Brussels office, from the bureaucracy.
Here. So unpractical, they could not attach a microphone to it. Thank you so much, University of Aveiro, for organizing this conference. I believe it's crucial because Bologna in the end is about unity, it's about doing it together, and that's the only answer we have in times of a political mess, polarization, wars on the continent, but also at our borders, nationalism, populism, crisis. What is our answer to this? It's unity, and this is why it's so crucial to talk about the Bologna process today. Unity is about that we are simply stronger together. It's not about losing competences, but it's about gaining strength.
Mm-hmm.
And in this context, I also would like to refer to Mario Draghi, who published this landmark report on European competitiveness. Yes. And also from this perspective, he said we must invest in our knowledge base. Europe's strength is maybe not the top institutions because they come maybe from the US, the UK, Switzerland, they're not in the EU, but it's the broad and the strong knowledge base we have, and this knowledge institutions have to work together to become stronger and to support European competitiveness that is much needed to ensure our current level of welfare. So the Bologna process as an intergovernmental process is crucial, spanning 48 countries. And I am here today to put next to this intergovernmental process an interinstitutional process, spanning 560 higher education institutions over 33 countries, and it was launched Monday. And that's called For You For All, and I created one slide. It will, yes, that's the For You For All project, and I motivate all of you to find For You For All on LinkedIn, because what you will see is a post of Monday showing all our members representing 560 institutions with the same For You For All background. And this gave me such a warm feeling because this is exactly what it is about. This is about unity in times of polarization. So all 64 European University Alliances, and I agree with Anthony who presented earlier the separate logos of all the 64 alliances, who can still follow this jungle of ambitious initiatives? Nobody. We need a guide. We need unity also here. We need to identify what are the very best practices that the European University Alliances produce that support the implementation of the Bologna process. So if the governments are not further implementing the Bologna tools, then institutions will do it. We will not wait for the policymakers. We will tell where to go. All those 64 European University Alliances are a member of For You For All. I am so happy to coordinate it. It's a project very, very close to my heart. And ECIU University is one of the oldest and the biggest European University Alliances with 14 partners. And the University of Aveiro, I'm so proud, it's one of our most committed members. And also the director, now, please wave, is based here at the University of Aveiro. So they are really key in implementing the ambitions of ECIU University. Paola Ferreira, when you described your vision for Bologna, I could see this is also the vision of ECIU University. We are very much aligned. So For You For All has brought all 64 European University Alliances together. What can you expect from this initiative? We will work on the joint definitions. For example, a key topic of the Bologna process is mobility. It's also a key topic of the alliances. We have to achieve 50% student mobility. So when we got feedback from the European Commission, congratulations, your alliance is funded, we were also a little bit scared because, oh my God, how to achieve 50% student mobility? And then we were thinking, what is actually student mobility? How to count it? How to define it? And there, for example, we need to work together with all 64 to come with a joint definition, a joint approach, joint guidelines on how to implement this ambition. There you see we are stronger together. Another example, and it was mentioned before, is also the research and innovation dimension, because of course you are not a European university if you don't have also research and innovation collaboration. If it's just about education, you are more a college or a mobility initiative. No, we are European universities. But how to link the ERA and the European higher education area? Also, colleagues in the European research area are wondering about this. There is actually, I don't know, so the ERA consists of a revamped ERA action agenda of 20 actions. And one of those actions, number 18, is exactly about establishing links with the European higher education area. So we are discussing it in the Bologna process. There's a task force. In the ERA governance, there is an action about it. So there is willingness, but how to implement this? European University Alliances want to support there. Another example is that we are not there yet. A few weeks ago, the EU councils agreed about a council recommendation on academic careers. Very important that we invest in academic careers. But only last year, our ministers in research agreed on a recommendation on research careers. So these processes really work in parallel and we can join forces much more. Alliances here also say we need a holistic approach to university funding, because Horizon Europe in the field of research and Erasmus Plus in the field of education is not supporting the multi-mission approach of universities, serving not only in the field of education, but also research, innovation, service to society, and how to implement our ambitions if we have two separate, fully separate funding programs, without any funding streams between the two programs. Well, there are so many links between the European Innovation Council, which is about entrepreneurship. Why isn't Erasmus Plus supporting these ambitions? And why isn't Horizon Europe supporting the ambitions of the European Universities Initiative? There is a lot of potential there. It was mentioned also by Anthony, the need, and Michael Gabel of the EUA, the need for interoperability. So we cannot build a digital campus without investing in making our systems in Europe interoperable. And this is super urgent. There are now 64 alliances working in parallel building a digital campus. And we all now know that IT skills are super scarce. It costs a lot of money. So it is completely crazy that we are building with public funding 64 separate digital campuses. Why not making it open source? Why not making our systems interoperable? I know Anthony, in another conference, he mentioned what we actually need is a Bologna process focused on digitalization, because the ministers of higher education should talk about this. I have two more examples, and then I give the floor back to you. One is key. It sounds boring, but it is absolutely key. I have a legal background, and I have to say a legal status, for example, to maintain the digital campus, how to maintain it as 12 different legal institutions is absolutely key to overcome transnational obstacles in higher education collaboration. So we need a European legal status. ECIU has a Dutch foundation right now as a legal status. It can help us in issuing micro-credentials, but the Dutch legal status in Portugal, you don't understand what a Dutch foundation is about. So we need a European recognized legal status to support transnational higher education collaboration. And the key topic for the alliances is also the European degree. I mentioned it on the slide. We will go back to Warsaw. So I didn't know, it's where apparently the Bologna process started in 1996 with Joe Ritsen. I've heard many stories about him. I don't know him personally. And we will go back there under the Polish presidency, starting the 1st of January. In June, there will be a big conference on the European degree. There will be European degree policy labs to implement the joint criteria we agreed upon. So this is what you talked about it. We can agree about all types of criteria, but we need to implement it with the support of our quality assurance agencies, with the support of our ministries. And this is exactly what we will discuss in Warsaw in June. And Anthony also mentioned, I'm a little bit lost. What is the latest data on micro-credentials offerings of the alliances? Here I can make you very happy, Anthony. There will be a report by the European Commission. It's like a Christmas gift. It will be published before Christmas on the transformative potential of the European University Alliances. And there will be a second report coming up with the results of the policy pilot projects on the legal status and the European degree and how to move further. Because I completely agree, we should not stop by having common agreements and common criteria. We should now implement our common criteria, and you can count here on the 64 European University Alliances to support this implementation. Thank you so much.
Well, let me just make two more very short comments. One is Joe Ritsen is a good friend of mine and a good friend of Portugal. So very positive thing. Joe Ritsen is not an unknown people. He's someone very well known. The second one is, if you talk about the European University, never forget UK. Never forget UK. Whatever UK decides, in political terms, in terms of Brexit and agreements with the European Union, never forget the university of UK. That is essential. We don't have much time. Our minister is in a rush, and I know a little bit about the rush for a minister, but I will allow one question, just one. It has to be a very relevant one, just one question. If we don't have any question, I think that we will ask our minister, because we know that the minister has to leave at past. You have a quarter of an hour, which I think it's okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you very much to Iris.
As you wish.
Or Iris.
Both are okay.
And Olga, thank you very much for your contribution. Unfortunately, we don't have time enough for questions. It should be interesting to ask questions, but we have to give the floor to our minister. Okay, thank you.
And that's it. So we now invite the Minister of Education, Science and Innovation, Fernando Alexandre, to take the floor.
I think I'm always in a rush, so it's not only today and now for this session. So first of all, I would like to congratulate University of Aveiro for this initiative, for this discussion on this very important topic for Portugal and for Europe. I have to say that I was always an enthusiastic about the Bologna process. In fact, In 2005, I was head of Department of Economics at University of Minho, and I led the implementation of Bologna process, and I participated in a lot of discussions about how to reformulate the economic and business degrees in Portugal. So there were different views. Not everybody was so enthusiastic as I was. But I think it was a very successful process, of course, with some dimensions that we still have to improve. Some of the results were not as we expected, but it was a big step toward a more flexible system that fostered mobility across Europe of students and workers. So it was very positive. So the system was very rigid before that. So we had very long degrees, and so the students had very small space to choose their paths. But concerning the assessment of these 20 years, I would like to stress one of the most important changes concerning the impact of this change in the duration of the first and second cycle. So in Portugal, we have a wage premium for the first cycle that is still quite significant. So it's like 40% above the secondary school. Okay, so it has been decreasing. So in 2010 it was like 50%. Now it is around 40%. But for masters, and that is the most important change that I would like to notice. So in 2010 it was like insignificant to have a master relative to a first cycle degree. So it was like 10% wage premium that resulted from having a master. And today, the last data that I saw, it was a very recent study by Planet. The wage premium for masters is like 70% relative to secondary school. So what really makes a difference now, it's not the bachelor degree, it is the master degree. And so when we think about equity, about equality of opportunities for students, we have to think about the access to masters. So the access to masters is quite different because so we have a tuition that is regulated for, well, currently everything is regulated concerning tuitions in Portugal. Too much regulated, in my view. So we focus too much on tuition and much less on the conditions to access the different degrees. And so that is very important. Okay, so the conditions to access to masters, it really makes a difference for students, because the wage premium that they get from the master that they attend is very different, and it really has an impact. So the first big change that I would like to stress is that the signaling effect of going to higher education now comes not from the first degree, from the bachelor, but it comes from the place where you take or the master that you take, okay? And so we have to look at master degrees because they really have a very, very significant impact on wages. So this is, this I think is the most important challenge that we have concerning access to higher education in Portugal. But people are still very focused on the tuition of the first degree. I don't know why, but okay. It's something that we have to discuss and to look at. Looking at the future, Professor Marcelo mentioned the geopolitical dimension or changes that we are facing all over the world, and in particular in Europe. And they are, in fact, it's not just the context, they really make a difference for the way we look at higher education. All these reports, and I would like to stress first the letter report that came out first, then the Draghi report. It elected the 5th freedom, so it's about the single market. So we have very different dimensions for the single market that if we really want to build and to strengthen the position of Europe in the world, we have to look at how different markets work and to surpass some of their fragilities that we still have. And what Letta told us, it was something very evident. Well, these reports are very important, but usually they do not tell, they don't bring news, they just stress some dimensions that we were already aware, but they are very useful. And these two reports, I think they are very, very useful. So, but the Letta report elected a new freedom for the European Union, that is the fifth freedom, that concerns education, research, and innovation. Okay, so and what Enrico Letta stresses is the fact that all these dimensions, as they were just mentioned in the previous session, are still very fragmented. All of them: research, innovation, and education. And so, in the current geopolitical context, it's not possible. It's not possible. It was evident like 10 years ago, but now it's something that you cannot hide. It's very clear to everybody. Is that Europe cannot compete with other geographic areas, namely the United States and China, without a single market or a common space or for higher education, research and innovation. It's just not possible. The amount of resources that we have, the scale that we need to be competitive, cannot be achieved through exclusively national policies or strategies. It's just not possible. In research, for instance, it's impossible to compete with the labs that the United States is building on chips and supercomputing, and also with what China is doing. If we do it alone, it's just not possible to do it. We are going to lag even behind that we are now lagging behind the United States and China. And concerning higher education, because you cannot disconnect the conditions for competition in research from the conditions for competition in higher education, because it's all about talent. So it's all about keeping the best professors, keeping the best researchers that are going to qualify the next generations. So if you don't have the best labs, you are not going to attract the best researchers. Okay, so if you go to, I was just in the United States like 2 weeks ago, and just in one lab, one US university got from the state more than $1 billion just for a clean room and for prototyping new chips. And of course, the capacity for that university to attract the best researchers you don't have, it's very difficult to compete with them, okay? Because the researcher, it doesn't look just for the wage, he looks for the conditions to do research. So if he has the possibility to go to a much better lab, he is going to move there, okay? And so when we talk about attracting talent, retaining the best students, you cannot do it without an infrastructure that will provide the conditions that researchers need. So when we talk about research careers, it's just not about stability, that is very important. As I just told to a group of people outside, it's of course very important, but you have to look at other dimensions that are really critical for the decisions that researchers, drive the decisions of researchers. So concerning higher education, I think the path is very obvious, okay? So what we need, it's not a new Bologna process, it's something that will foster this capacity to have mobility across Europe by students. So we have to become even more Europeans. Okay, so we have to have the degrees, the degrees that the universities are going to supply, to offer to the young people, have to provide the conditions for students to move across Europe. And when they finish, when they get the diplomas, they will be able to move across Europe. So we have to build this European space for higher education. That implies that, of course, we will always have some fragmentation. And when fragmentation is diversity, it's good. But this diversity cannot hinder the possibility for students to move and to benefit from that diversity. So Europe, we have to be very, very smart in order to benefit from the diversity that we have in different countries, in different institutions, that will allow a student from Aveiro to go to another institution in France, in Poland, and to meet different professors, to have different experiences. So the diversity is something that is good for Europe, but it cannot be an obstacle for mobility and for the possibility of the comparability of diplomas across Europe. Okay, so I really support, and it's something that it was one of my first messages to our institutions and services. We are not, but we have to be at the forefront of of building the European degree. So that is not consensual in Europe. Okay, there are some countries that are not enthusiastic. In fact, they are against the European degree. Okay, they just ask for deepen the Bologna process. So the European degree, it's a different step, and some countries, some big countries are against. We have to be aware of that. Okay, it's something that is not consensual in Europe, but respecting the autonomy of institutions, I think that the European alliances are important frameworks, and we should give them the resources to explore the possibility of having these European degrees. And of course, some of them will not do it. Some countries may not be so interested or enthusiastic in participating in that, but that is not an option. Okay, so we really have to have these European degrees, different forms of providing skills as the micro credentials, as we have seen, and what we have to, as I was challenged several times in the last panel, what we have to do is to build the context, the institutional context, the legal framework that will allow institutions to develop strategies and to implement them, but not from. So we should give the institutional context, and then bottom up, we should have. I'm sure we are going to have good projects, European projects that will make Europe stronger. So thank you very much, and congratulations again for organizing this important conference.
I would like to thank everyone for being here. The conference 5025 is adjourned.